You are building Singapore, we call it the deep tech sector. You're really focusing on deep innovation in the health and biomedical space. But you yourself, you come from the US, which is actually already a very rich innovation ecosystem. So I wanted to ask you, what pushed you or what compelled you to come to Singapore to pursue R&D?
Something that we're really focused on is to really bridge innovation with validation, and then ultimately to take that validation and move it to people at scale, which will take a lot more expertise than just the technical side. We need to be able to interact with regulators, with policymakers, with insurers, etc. And I think one of the most unique attributes about the Singapore ecosystem is the accessibility and also the agility of all of these key stakeholders in one place at one time. Because the more time we can save with efficiency, right? After you come up with an idea, you validate and you move towards scaling, it's about saving lives at this point. Anytime you can save time, it's lives saved. And I think that is the ultimate measure of impact of work, and that's what brought us here.
From your personal experience, what is the difference between the health tech innovation ecosystem in the US, where you're from or where you were trained, and in Singapore, maybe in terms of the way you collaborate with people or the way you conduct R&D?
One of the coolest parts about being here is what I call the ability to operate in a non-chronological manner. I think in innovation, we often think of coming up with the idea and then testing it out in a lab. And then from the lab, maybe it can go to preclinical, then to clinical, if one is fortunate enough. And then one thinks after they've done enough clinical work, which can take years, then they should speak to the regulatory community. And then after that works out, if it's regulated, maybe you can talk to manufacturing, depending on the tech, all the way to policy, to economics, so on and so forth. But I think what's important to note is that in this space, because the timelines can potentially be long, whenever you have an ecosystem where everybody's kind of close by, the ability to operate non-chronologically means we can think ahead a little bit and have some of these earlier discussions with the payers or the reimbursement or insurance side, or to meet with regulators earlier as well. And we did that. Thanks to many of our colleagues here, we had a very clear picture early on of kind of the types of testing we would need, how to get these clinical trials launched. And I think that type of closeness within an ecosystem is very unique. Yes, Singapore might be geographically small, but I think the core advantage for innovation is in this space is for that contact between the stakeholders to happen efficiently. If we were to work with our regulators and set up meeting times, we're talking about a time scale of potentially even days to have some of these important upfront meetings. In other ecosystems, it could take months to years to have some of these discussions just because of that scale. And so when we can condense things into a time frame that is so actionable, technology can advance faster. Validation can happen in a more efficient manner. And as I mentioned, lives get saved this way. And I think when we measure the impact we want to make, trying to be as efficient as possible matters.
When you share that, it reminds me of how in Singapore, everything is kind of optimized to reduce like coordination costs. And that was also a key component in facilitating innovation. Now, if you were to have a pitch to, the other technologists in your space and you're trying to get them to work on big problems and you want to get them to Singapore, what are the other points that you would make to them to come and work in Singapore?
There's so many. I think one of the first ones goes back to the concept of not having to operate chronologically. I want to highlight that a little bit more. I think that when developing new technologies, we also have to think about things like clinical trial design and innovation in that space. I'll give you an example. So typically in clinical trials, a patient will be randomized. They get enrolled into the trial and they're randomized to get a low dose, a middle dose, or a high dose of this drug. If a patient does not respond to that high dose, they're typically removed from the trial, non-responder. And we'll never have known if this patient could have responded to the middle dose or the low dose. And we know this because when we look at some of the data that's pre-existing, and consulting with our clinical collaborators, much of that data doesn't exist for a number of the diseases. So this is where we differentiate. We allow each person to see the different doses. And that's okay because somebody's getting those doses. So these are safe and they're allowed. But just getting that little bit of extra information per person can give us more certainty of whether something's effective or not, or maybe what the best dose is for that person. I want to be clear that our goal is not to just go and wholesale low dose every patient. That's actually not the goal. Our goal is to find more responders. So that's the technical side. But back to the key question of the agility, right, of the ecosystem. There's a technology component here which allows us to find the right dose. But the trial designs that we use, the methods of how we analyze statistics, I think we need to think beyond our own echo chamber of our group. We need to speak to the regulators to understand if this line of reasoning is sound and if this data will be useful down the road for things like regulatory considerations. Instead of us kind of thinking, oh, this sounds pretty good, let's just run the trial, get approval for it, and see how it goes, we have the ability to speak to the regulators early. And I think that's alone a remarkable resource to have. And if we want to also understand things like, does our approach help to alleviate or reduce financial challenges for the patient? Because we might be finding lower doses. If we're finding lower doses, we might be reducing readmissions into the hospital. These are questions we can also answer in the course of this research. I remember in a recent conference I was at, when we think about optimizing outcomes, what does that really mean? In some cases, optimizing is just give the highest dose. Find that highest dose and give it and see if it works. But for us, it's find the optimal patient outcome. But what does that mean? And in our case, we're able to make it a multitude of definitions. Optimal efficacy of treatment, optimal safety, so lack of toxicity, and even try to optimize or reduce financial toxicity as well to the patient, of which when we think about the welfare of the patient, we can consider all of these elements because our ecosystem can help us answer those questions so quickly. So it's just about as multifaceted as we can get when it comes to answering the hard questions.
It really goes back to the idea of from idea rolling out to implementation. Singapore is, I think, a good place where you can compress your timelines, which I think makes sense. I think as a Singaporean, just looking out into the world, I think especially in the US, you have a federal system. You probably have very different approaches towards governance where you might have to go through different levels of clearance. Whereas like the good thing about being a city state is that you're relatively centralized, which helps.
Yeah, the rigor is there across all the ecosystems, but I think it's this agility. This is an agility that's truly remarkable.